Throughout the years, the issue of racism has persisted across various cultures and societies. But what you don't hear talked about nearly as often, if at all, is racism against white people. Many claim that racism towards white people can exist, while others say that even a statement such as this is in and of itself racist. This has led to several people making derogatory comments towards or discriminating against white people, often on social media, because of the fact that they are white. They then simply claim that this action is permissible, since, as they claim, racism towards white people cannot exist. The goal of this video is to highlight a few instances of racial prejudice against white people, and then present logical arguments for why they are wrong, regardless of whether or not they are classified as racism. Before we can make a claim about whether racism towards white people exists or not, we first have to define the term racism. If one simply does a Google search, there are two definitions for racism that appear. In the first definition, racism is defined as prejudice, discrimination, or antagonism by an individual, community, or institution against a person or people on the basis of their membership in a particular racial or ethnic group, typically one that is a minority or marginalized. In the second, it is defined as the belief that different races possess distinct characteristics, abilities, or qualities, especially so as to distinguish them as inferior or superior to one another. The first definition considers prejudice by an individual against an individual on the basis of race to be racism. Since this could happen to anybody, it is clear that racism towards white people can exist under this definition. The second definition defines racism as a belief. Since anyone can have a belief, regardless of whether or not it is true, this definition would also maintain that racism towards white people can in fact exist. Therefore, we can say that, by the definitions of racism given by Google, racism towards white people can exist. If this is so clearly the case, why do so many people dispute this? The confusion arises from people defining racism in a different way than the ways previously mentioned. Many people think of racism through the lens of sociology, and they view it as a system of oppression. Dr. Workunita, who has a PhD in sociological anthropology from UCLA, puts it the following way. Racism is a mechanism where resources and unfortunately power, wealth, prestige, and even humanity are distributed along a color line. That's what racism is about. People who agree with this definition would most likely say that the first definition provided by Google is referring to prejudice. However, they define racism as prejudice with the addition of the aspect of power. They argue that since white people have always had the aspect of power in the United States, they can therefore not be the victims of racism. Therefore, by sociologists' definition, racism cannot exist towards white people. So now we can clearly see that the confusion lies in conflicting definitions of the word racism. But let's go back to what we mentioned at the beginning of the video. The issue we're trying to address is how people are discriminatory towards white people, while justifying it by saying that racism towards white people simply can't exist. So let's assume that we accept the sociological definition of racism that was just presented. In other words, we have defined racism as racial prejudice plus power. Now let's take a look at an example of some of the discriminatory remarks that are being made against white people on social media.
Controversial opinion, but if you have a token white and you're hanging out with your friend group of color, you need to ask permission from everybody in the group to bring your white friend. Don't just bring them. Ask for explicit permission from everyone, because just because you're comfortable with them doesn't mean that everybody's comfortable with them. I might not be in the mood to deal with white shenanigans that day. That's all I'm saying. And another thing, it feeds into their ego. Don't let them think they're a good white person. Don't give them that card to use against other people. Please don't do that.
This content creator is effectively saying that people should ask permission from their friend group to bring a friend along simply because of that friend's race. Imagine if the race in question were replaced with anything other than white. Is there any question that there would be immediate outrage at someone making such a statement? But by definition, we have determined that this video is not an example of racism, as the structure of racism does not exist towards white people. But let us ask this question. Does the fact that what is said in this video is not defined as racism mean that it's a proper thing to say? Of course not. Whether or not it is racism is independent of the fact that it is a discriminatory claim. Let's observe another example that took place at Arizona State University. Here, two students, who appear to be white, were sitting in what was apparently a multicultural center at the campus. They were then confronted by a couple of students who asked them to leave, claiming that they felt uncomfortable because one of the students had a Police Lives Matter sticker on his computer. Throughout the ensuing argument, the student filming makes a claim that the multicultural space is a place where white people are not being centered, and she says that white is not a culture.
No, I said
You're making the space uncomfortable. But you're white. Do you understand what a multicultural space? It means you're not being centered.
White's not a culture?
no.
No, it's not a culture. It's white is not a culture. Say it again to the camera. You think whiteness is a culture?
However, the definition of culture is not limited to race. Every country has their own culture. In the current developed state of the world, it is inherently impossible for someone to come from a country that does not possess a culture of some kind. Suppose these students were Italian. Italian culture includes things such as language, foods, and architectural style, to name a few. Would it make any sense to say that these students did not have a culture? Even if whiteness is not considered to be a culture in and of itself, everyone inherently possesses a culture, so it is nonsensical to try to exclude someone from a multicultural space by saying that they do not have a culture. Later in the video, one of the students being confronted appears to call the confronters racist, to which the person recording responds, "There's no such thing as reverse racism, so have fun thinking that we're the racists."
The type of people that they protect. Okay, this white man thinks he can take up our space. Every single part of the campus centers you. This is the only space that you're not centered, and you're still trying to center yourself, which is peak white cis male bullshit.
I just told you to shut the fuck up because you're making me feel unsafe in this space.
There's no such white people. There's no such thing as reverse racism. So have fun thinking that we are the racist ones. There's no such thing.
This is a clear example of how the definition of racism is being abused to be used as an excuse to discriminate against people based on their race. The person filming claims that reverse racism does not exist, effectively saying that racism towards white people does not exist. Again, we must ask the question, does this make their actions any more justified? A prejudicial action or statement does not become right simply because it does not qualify as racism. Judging someone based off of the color of their skin is still wrong, even if it does not fall under the structure of racism. Let's look at one more example from a few years ago, which involved the uncovering of several tweets from a journalist that appeared to mock and show great disdain for white people. The journalist, Sarah Jeong, was hired for the position she was applying for at the New York Times even after the tweets were uncovered. This led to a debate, which can be summarized in the title of this Washington Post article about the situation. Is it okay to make fun of white people online? People who were against Jeong's hiring claimed that her tweets were racist, while those who defended her used the argument that racism can exist against white people due to its systemic nature. So the argument essentially shifted to whether or not the tweets could be considered racism. But is this really what the argument should have been about? Whether or not the tweets are considered a direct example of racism in no way takes away from their prejudicial nature. However, because of the confusion over the definition of racism, people began arguing about whether or not the tweets were racist, rather than purely if they were acceptable or not. Just because a prejudicial comment is not an example of racism, does not mean it is acceptable. People who believe that racism is systemic, and therefore impossible against white people in the US, might say that when people are prejudicial towards white people, it doesn't contribute to the overall power structure in the way that prejudiced comments towards people of color do. While this may be true, let us ask this question. Does that make it right? Prejudiced comments towards white people may not contribute to an overall power structure, so it could be argued that they are less damaging overall than prejudiced comments towards minorities. But this doesn't mean that they're not damaging at all. Look at this comment that was made on a YouTube video. The person says, "I have been racially bullied for the past week, and when I tried to say something, everyone was like, 'You can't be racist towards a white person.'" Some people are now condoning prejudiced comments towards white people on the basis of their race because of the fact that they are not considered racist. Since they don't contribute to an overall power structure, they are not nearly as damaging as racially prejudiced comments towards minorities. But what does the individual being bullied care about the power structure? Saying that racial prejudice against white people is acceptable simply because it isn't racism is essentially saying that bullying is acceptable, as long as it doesn't contribute to an overall power structure. But bullying is frowned upon in our society. Judging someone based on their appearance is generally shunned. This is what we have been taught in schools and hopefully by our parents and other adults. Imagine you're in elementary school, and you make fun of someone because they are short. Your discriminatory comments wouldn't necessarily impact the opportunities that the short person had, like jobs or housing. But you would still be told by your teacher not to say that. Some people can say that since racial prejudice against white people has not risen to the level of racism against minorities, it is not as big of an issue. But that's not the claim that is being made. The claim that is being made is not that racial prejudice against white people is as big of an issue as racism against minorities, but rather that both of them are wrong. Allowing prejudice to continue, whilst not being criticized, will only serve to increase division among people, and normalizing these prejudiced views is dangerous to our society. Let us remember not to judge anyone by the color of their skin, but to look at people as unique individuals.